Antidiuretic hormone. So let us have a look at this slide in which we can see a person who's lost his way in the desert and he's feeling very thirsty because he's dehydrated for over 30 hours and heat exposure is more than 35 degree. So I want to know what will happen next. Which hormone will be released to bring about conservation of water? How will it be released? Why it will be released? And how does it act? So you can think over it. So then we can start with the discussion part. So which hormone will be released? It will be the antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone, as we know, is also known by the name of ADH, and it decreases the excretion of water and thereby it brings about the conservation of water, and this is done by the V2 receptors which are located in the collecting duct and the principal cells. So it is also known by the name of vasopressin. As the name suggests, vasopressin, that means it acts on the blood, acts by modulating the blood pressure by acting on the blood vessels. Vaso stand for blood vessels and pressin stand for the pressure effect exerted on these blood vessels. So normally this doesn't happen, but whenever this ADH concentration is raised so much that it reaches in the supraphysiological dose, it acts through the V1 receptors to bring about vasoconstriction. Now the question is, how will the antidiuretic hormone be released? So let us try to understand that how this ADH is being synthesized and transported. So I say that this ADH is a neuroendocrine type of hormone. What we understand by this? It means that ADH is not synthesized by the endocrine gland, but it is synthesized by the neurons which are present in the hypothalamus, and then it reaches the blood capillaries through which it is carried to the target organs. So I would like you to identify these structures which are present in the hypothalamus. They are responsible for the synthesis of the ADH. They are the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. The neuronal cell bodies are lying in the hypothalamus. So what happens? Whenever there is a stimulus, they will start the synthesis of ADH just like any other protein hormone for pre-pro forms, then pro form, and then finally the active form. It is a nanopeptide. So what will happen next? It will be transported to the posterior pituitary. How? It will be transported along these axonal pathways, and it will be transported not alone but with the association of a carrier protein, and this carrier protein is known by the name of neurophysin. So ADH, loosely bound to the neurophysin, is traveling down these axons and finally it will be reaching these nerve endings. And what do you see in these nerve endings? These nerve endings are very close to the blood capillaries which are present here. So what will happen? These nerve endings will release by the process of exocytosis the ADH which they are carrying into the blood capillaries. So this ADH, once it reaches the blood capillaries, it will be reaching the target site through the by traveling in the blood. So this transport mechanism starts from the neuron and then it is carried by the capillaries to the target sites. Okay. So I put forward another statement that these circumventricular organs are also helpful and play a role in the release of ADH hormone. So do you support that? Okay. These circumventricular organs, as we know, they do not have a blood-brain barrier. So what will happen? The capillaries which are present there, since they are fenestrated, they have pores in them. So whatever fluid is present in the extracellular fluid or extracellular spaces will also come through these fenestrated capillaries into the circumventricular organ. So the circumventricular organs are basically sampling the extracellular fluid for its composition. So whatever is the composition of this extracellular fluid, it will influence these neurons which are present in the circumventricular organ. So what will be the effect? Now comes the role of these osmoreceptors. Osmo means osmolarity and the receptor for these are known by the name of osmoreceptors. So they are located somewhere in or near the hypothalamus and are basically the modified neurons. So we know the plasma osmolarity ranges from 275 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. So have you thought of a condition? What happens if this osmolarity is not maintained? So whenever there is an increase in sodium and glucose, what will happen? The plasma osmolarity will also rise, as you can see in this formula. So what will happen to the neurons? You know about the process of osmosis. So whenever there is increase in the tonicity, increase in the sodium content around the neuron, what will happen? The process of osmosis will start, and as a result of which the fluid which is present in the neurons will be pulled out by the process of osmosis by these osmoreceptors. So what will happen to the size? The size will decrease. The neurons will shrink. And whenever these neurons have started shrinking, as you can see here, the rate of discharge of the neuron will start to increase. You can compare when a neuron is a normal one and a neuron when it is in a shrunken form. The osmoreceptors start the increased firing of the neurons. So what will happen whenever there is an increased rate of discharge of neurons? It will cause the increased activation of neurons which are present in hypothalamus. Which neurons? The paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic. And we know when they are stimulated, they will cause the synthesis and release of ADH. So can we link the plasma osmolarity with the ADH? Yes. So whenever there is a change in the plasma osmolarity, there is also a change in the firing of the neurons of osmoreceptors, and there is a change in the secretion of ADH. So when we were talking about that case of a person who is deprived of water, so what will happen? The plasma osmolarity in that person will rise. That will cause increase in ADH secretion. Now you see the same slide. So we have already covered which hormone will be released. We know by now how and where it will be released. Next is why it will be released. The stimuli for its release, we need to understand that. So why this ADH will be released in this person, or what is the stimuli for the release of ADH? So we have already covered this. The plasma osmolarity plays an important role in the release of ADH. The various conditions you can see in which the plasma osmolarity is affected. It may be heat stroke, loss of lot of water in cases of burns, in cases of injecting hypertonic saline solution. So in all these conditions, what is happening? The plasma osmolarity is increasing. So there are also conditions in which plasma osmolarity decreases. It may be due to fluid overload. The plasma osmolarity may also decrease. So what will happen in this condition? Can you interpret this graph? Based upon this release of ADH and the plasma osmolarity, we'll try to understand what is happening here. We already said that plasma osmolarity ranges from a normal of 275 to 290. So here in the graph we have plotted it as 270 to 280. We have taken it as normal plasma osmolarity, and the ADH secretion you can also see is normally maintained. So whatever happens now is at this point the plasma osmolarity you can see is increasing. It is increasing from this point to this 295, then it is reaching 300, then it is reaching 310. So look at what is happening to the ADH level. The ADH level has also risen in response to the increase in plasma osmolarity. So can we conclude that plasma osmolarity has also effect on raising of ADH level? That means ADH secretion is directly linked to the plasma osmolarity. Whenever it is increased, the ADH increases, and whenever it decreases, the ADH level will fall. So let us have a flow chart of the event that are occurring in this. First, there is an increase in plasma osmolarity that is brought about by dehydration or the fluid loss. and this will lead to the stimulation of the osmoreceptors, which leads to the pulling out of water and shrinkage of these osmoreceptors. The shrinkage is associated with the increase in rate of discharge of the neurons, and this discharge will result in increased synthesis from the paraventricle and the supraoptic neuron, which are present where? In the hypothalamus, and these will then cause release of ADH. By the process of transport, they will be reaching posterior pituitary, and by the process of exocytosis, they will finally be entering to the blood capillaries, and from it will be transported all the way along to the kidney, where it brings about the reabsorption of the water. So kidney will be the target site for the action of ADH in this case. So it is clear. So I had been saying that ADH is a protein hormone. So can you comment on the type of transport it will have in the blood? Its binding to the plasma protein, what will happen to its half-life, metabolic clearance, and which type of hormonal receptors it will be utilizing, since it is a protein category type of hormone. So you can think about it. So here we have the answers for that. Since it is a protein hormone, it will be transported in a free form. And since it is transported in the free form, what will happen? It is not binding to any protein. So what will happen? The plasma half-life will be short. It will be very fast metabolic clearance. It will be rapidly cleared by the tissues, by the uptake by the liver, by uptake by the kidney, and then it will be excreted by both these systems. Then its action, it acts through the plasma membrane receptors. Why? Because it is a protein, it cannot diffuse through the plasma membrane. It needs some receptors to bring about these action, and these receptors are present on the plasma membrane, and they are G protein coupled receptors. And finally, they'll be acting here in the kidney, that is the collecting duct, and the, you can see here, cortical collecting duct, where there is reabsorption of the water. So we have what we have covered, what will happen next, which hormone is released, and how it will be released. Why it will be released, now we know it is linked to the plasma osmolarity. We are clear with that. So the next point is, how will it act? Meaning the ADH is released, it is reached the kidney. Now we want to know how it is bringing about the reabsorption of the water. What is the mechanism of action? So let's understand that. Now here in this animation, what do we see? We see a nephron. A nephron, you can see the principal cells of the late distal tubule and the collecting duct. We have been talking about ADH. So what happens? ADH reaches this collecting duct. As you can see here, it has reached here, and this then binds to the ADH receptor, and then it will cause activation of this V2 receptor. This V2 receptor lead to the synthesis of these channels, which are, as you can see, are the aquaporin. They are either inactivated or they are increased in the number by this activation of this receptor. They will move all the way along to this apical membrane, and the apical membrane, here you can see the kidney is filtering the filtrate, that is water. It will come inside the cell through these pores, and then it will leave the cell through another aquaporin. So this aquaporin which is present on the basolateral side is the aquaporin number 3 and 4, and which is present on the apical side is aquaporin number 2. So there is finally reabsorption of water into the blood capillary, that is the peritubular capillary. So here we have the line diagram of the phenomena that we are talking about. First, ADH. It binds to the G protein coupled receptors. Here you can see they are the V2 receptors, which are G protein coupled receptors. The protein is GS, or the stimulatory protein, leading to the formation of cyclic AMP by conversion of ATP into cyclic AMP, which will activate protein kinase A. Once this protein kinase A is activated, we know it will lead to the increased synthesis of the aquaporin channel by acting at the level of genes, or bringing about the activation of already present aquaporin. So what will happen? You can see here, these aquaporin channels are moving all the way along to the basolateral, to the apical side of the lumen. Here, the apical side of the lumen, the kidney is filtrating the water. So what will happen? The water will move through this pore. Aquaporins are nothing but the pores. So water will move along the concentration gradient from the lumen into the cell. You can see here it has moved here. Then this water will be carried all the way across the cell and it reaches the basolateral side where aquaporin number 3 and 4 are present, and here the water is being released into the peritubular capillary vessels. You can see here, and the reabsorption of water will occur. So urine volume will start to decrease. So urine osmolarity will increase. Why? Because volume is more, osmolarity will naturally be less. And what will happen to the plasma osmolarity? The volume is increased, so plasma osmolarity will decrease. So no more stimulation for the ADH. So after some time, ADH secretion and this whole process action will stop once the plasma osmolarity has been normalized. So this type of feedback mechanism is which type of feedback mechanism? Let us go through this. Increase in plasma osmolarity, causing the posterior pituitary to stimulate the release of ADH. ADH is causing water reabsorption through aquaporin. Water is reabsorbed. Then what is happening, as we said, more water, so less is the plasma osmolarity. So it will cause negative inhibition of further release of ADH. So this negative inhibitory process is also known by the name of negative feedback control mechanism. So we are clear with all these questions. So what we are left is why it will be released. So let us talk about the situation where a person has met with a road traffic accident, as you can see, and he has lost lot of blood, that is exceeding 10% maybe. And this, I say, has resulted in increased secretion of ADH hormone. So why do you think ADH is being released, and how do you think the ADH release is possible in this situation where there is a hemorrhage or blood loss? So here in the slide you can see that ADH release is not only brought about by the stimulation of osmoreceptors, but we also have a secondary mechanism here which is present as arterial blood pressure receptors or the baroreceptor. Baro means pressure, and the receptors which sense the pressure present in the blood vessels are known by the name of baroreceptors. They may be present in the arterial blood vessels, for example the aortic and the carotid arch, or they may be present in the veins, or they may be present in the atria or the ventricle. So they are in fact known by the name of volume receptors. So let's try to understand their mechanism. So let's talk about these baroreceptors, or in fact the volume receptors, which are affected by the volume which is present in the vasculature, and they then cause the differential release of ADH. For example, whenever there is a hemorrhage or blood loss or dehydration, as you can see in different conditions, or the conditions where there is more than 10% or greater of hypovolemia occurring, so what will happen? It tends to cause the stimulation of ADH. In general, this doesn't happen, but it is linked to the pathological hypovolemia. So over a physiological range, the effective circulatory volume is normal. So ADH mainly is determined by the plasma osmolarity. So these conditions are pathological whenever there is more of blood loss. For example, during the delivery of a child, there may be excessive loss of blood from the mother, or there are conditions, for example, as burns, as you can see, or hypovolemic conditions due to other reasons. So these volume receptors are stimulated. So let us try to understand how these baroreceptors are causing the release of ADH. Baroreceptors, as I said, they are present in the low volume areas. For example, they may be present in the atria. We have the stretch receptors there. So whenever they are stimulated, that means whenever there is a low volume of blood present in the atria, it will cause the stimulation of these receptors, leading to the stimulation of these vasomotor centers. These vasomotor centers, which are present in the medulla oblongata, will cause the stimulation or the excitation of the neurons of the paraventricular neurons. And we know these paraventricular neurons are present in the hypothalamus. Once they are stimulated, it will also cause the stimulation and release of ADH hormone. You can see here the ADH, there is release of ADH hormone, and finally this ADH hormone is responsible for bringing the opposite effect, that is, it causes the increase in the blood volume in response to the decreased blood volume sensed by the baroreceptors. So we are okay with it. So these are some other conditions which are either acting through osmoreceptors or either acting through baroreceptors, and finally they are causing the release of ADH in all these conditions. So you can have a look at these. So let's also talk about the other role of the ADH, as we said, is vasopressin, or the regulator of blood pressure by mediating contraction of these blood vessels. So it is mediated through the V1 receptor. So whenever ADH is increased in amount, it reaches the supraphysiological doses. For example, in cases of hemorrhage, what will happen? This V1 receptors will be activated by ADH, and this will then result in the contraction of the blood vessels. So what will happen when blood vessel is contracted? It will cause an increase in blood pressure. So by this mechanism, by acting on V1 receptor, it is causing increased blood pressure, which help to bring back the blood volume towards normal. So this is a synergistic effect by acting on V1 receptors.